بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على نبي كريم محمد وعلى آله الطيبين والصحبه الصالحين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. It's good to be back in UBC. You know, I just discovered that UBC is right next to the shore. I've been going all these years and I was thinking, it's too bad I have to go to UBC and I wanted to go to the beach. I didn't know that you already had the beach right next to you guys. And I saw it from the plane as well. I took some nice pictures of UBC. It's like, wait a second, that's UBC. And it's right next to the shore. It's a really nice location, but apparently very expensive in Vancouver. I'd love to come here, but I don't think I can afford to even get off the plane. I mean, I'm already in debt now. It's just breathing the air. So, last year I came as part of the Islam Awareness Week, and I delivered a lecture on different ideologies which cause strife amongst humans and Muslims more specifically. I think the lecture I gave was about an hour or so, hour and a bit, but the event didn't end for the next 5 hours after that, because there was tons of Q&A. Now, but I was deeply disappointed though. I was very, very disappointed. I always hope when I give lectures that there'll be some people in the audience that will be like, "You're wrong," and I will speak out against you, and I shall denounce you in public, and I shall expose your ignorance of my particular ideology, because you'd only ever condemn it if you're ignorant of it. Of course, you wouldn't condemn it because you have legitimate reasons to. So, and no one did it. Right? No one did it. I mean, I didn't think I was that scary, or so. I don't buy it much. But no one brought contention. I said, look, I'll give privilege. I will give privilege time. I'll give the first person, the first person to speak. I'll give that privilege to someone who has a contention. And then no one did. But then afterwards, sometime afterwards, some individuals apparently reported that they were not convinced with what I said, and that they attended. I said, well, why don't you just raise the issue? So, I'm going to try to make it even more easier for you, for people to raise contentions. And I want to tell everybody here that I want you to listen to this from the angle of not, we have to believe him because he's got a really great accent and he's wearing a suit, so he must be right. He's got some white hairs on his beard, so he must be ma'soom, infallible. No, I want you to listen to this with the aim to disprove everything I say. All of you, okay? Now, you might not know the quotations and where I get, you might have not read the books, so that's fine. But I would ask you to find those quotations and read them in context. Make sure I haven't taken them out of context. Make sure that I'll be talking about historical events, and I can't give references for every single historical event. To do that, I'd have to be a lecturer here at UBC and teach a months-long course to go through the history of Western civilization and so on and so forth. But if what I say is wrong, research it afterwards and feel free to publicize where I've made mistakes. Right? That's how we keep public speakers and da'is and shuyukh in check, is you have to check what they say. Okay, don't just believe it on blind faith. Okay. As for today's session will be on liberalism and conservatism, and some individuals were wondering, I think there was some discussion, some people imagined I was going to come here today and advocate Islam is compatible with liberalism and conservatism. I was like, have you met me? Have you not heard what I've been saying for 20 years? Am I not clear enough? Is it my accent's hard to understand, perhaps? Not quite. This is Kufr Awareness Week, so everything is kufr in terms of the discussions that we'll be going through. Umar radiallahu anhum, the Sahabi, he said that he feared, paraphrase, he feared for a time when Muslims wouldn't know kufr. Because when they don't know kufr, they'll fall back into it and unrealized, and they'll make the same mistakes. History repeats itself again and again and again. So, and we're going to talk about that. Now, I also want to say that I'm not going to issue judgment on any Muslim that might be following any of the ideas that we are discussing. Muslims generally, as a civilization, we've forgotten political fiqh. We don't know what Islam says about economics or detailed beyond just pay your zakat and so on, and don't invest in riba and so on and so forth. The Muslim Ummah, after colonialism, but even before that, we went into intellectual decline. And we just took a very simplistic understanding of Islam, and that enabled us to be conquered, and enabled us to go into decline. And after colonialism, they basically wiped our education system clean. Well, what they actually did is they just defunded it, and they funded Western education system. Of course, if you want to be an engineer or a doctor, you go through the kind of Western education system, which won't just teach you the physical sciences, it will happen to also teach you Western philosophies of ethics and so on and so forth, things which are nothing to do with the physical sciences, okay, they have a particular bias. And of course, if you can't achieve anything, if you're not very clever, you get maybe just 50% in your exams, don't worry, you can always become an Islamic scholar. That's the perception in the Muslim world, though. Right? Am I wrong about this? You've probably heard this yourself. I'm not saying that Islamic scholars lack intellect. Of course, that we have some amazing intellects amongst them. But I'm simply saying that's the perception currently in the Muslim world. So I don't begrudge or condemn any Muslim that has fallen into any of these particular ideologies, because if I didn't have any guidance, I might do the same. If you read any of the books by any Western philosophers on any of these madahib, the schools of thought of the West, you will be convinced. Each and every one of them is convincing. If you have no other idea of what humans are and purpose of life, but judging good and bad, and what does morality mean, what does ethics mean, what does justice mean. If you don't know any of those things from an Islamic perspective, of course you're going to follow the Western concepts. And of course, Muslim parents, mainly because they themselves are victims of this, they generally view politics or political theory, or fiqh basically, resolving the affairs and guiding the affairs of the Muslim Ummah as something that can generate fitna for this child. They'll put the child into fitna, they'll be accused of extremism or Islamism or what have you, whatever Western pejoratives they have for going back to a holistic Islam, and they just keep their children from that. The madrasas don't teach political fiqh, they don't teach you economics from the Islamic perspective. Yeah, they teach you obviously tajweed, and they teach you fiqh of salah and so on and so forth. Nothing wrong with that, of course, but they just have omitted other things. And so then what do you think? A youngster, as all young people, we want to change the world. I said we there, quite optimistically. We want to change the world, and we want to make a mark. We want to right the wrongs, and we don't understand why people are following previous customs that don't make sense to us. And so why can't we just remove the obstacles and just make the most logical choices to solve the problems that we see in the world? Every young person wants to do that, or most do anyway. And if you don't give them the Islamic perspective, that empty lacuna will be filled with something that will, and it won't be on guidance. So I don't judge any Muslim here who may adopt any particular ideology. If you think I have misrepresented these schools of thought that you might have followed, or you think that they don't contradict Islam, I'll create a safe space. I welcome you to mention it. I've never ever condemned anyone for raising contentions. In fact, heck, do it as devil's advocate if you like. Just do it for the sake of just challenging. Because you learn more by challenging than you do by blindly following and accepting. So anyway, that's my preamble done. Let's get started with a question that, notice this is not the wrong lecture. It's like, isn't it about capitalism? What are you talking about Christianity for? I'm going to ask the audience a question. Why does Christianity seem so different from Judaism, right? Abrahamic religion. Judaism doesn't have the idea of original sin. Judaism doesn't have the idea that you have to be taken over by a Holy Spirit to make you good. Judaism doesn't have the idea that the blood sacrifice of a human being is required to pay for your sins. Neither does Islam. Islam and Judaism seem to be quite similar. But what happened with Christianity? Where did these ideas come from? Anyone have any ideas? Sorry, put your hand up so I can. No, did you make that comment? Sorry.
The Roman Empire.
What about the Roman Empire?
The pagan beliefs of the Roman Empire because they want to unify the people under them. So they kind of had to merge the beliefs into this new religion that was pretty popular.
You saying that the Roman Empire wanted to merge the beliefs of the people under them, and that's why. Not quite. Brother there in the grey top or in the black top?
The various councils that they've held regarding their faith have lots of divergences, and that was the biggest thing. So they did at one point a truly monotheistic or oneness, what they call non-Trinity. But they moved away from that after the Council of Nicaea.
So after the Council of Nicaea, they diverged. Chalcedon, but yes. No, because that was already hundreds of years later after early Christians. Something happened. What happened to the Christians in the Roman Empire? So I'll go just to this side for one sec. Brother there, the leather jacket.
The Catholic Church chose certain particular texts to canonize and kind of burn the rest. So the Bible used to be a category of literature like Pon Biblion, and a lot of those works that were preserved were just Pauline theology. And Paul kind of changed a lot of the core teachings of the original message.
Saul of Tarsus changed a lot of the original message, otherwise called was Saint Paul. Why do you think Saint Paul changed or added to, did bid'ah, all right, added to doctrines that had not previously existed in early Christian communities in the Church of Jerusalem, basically in the Middle East? I'm going to move over to this side now. I'm going to resist the urge to call it right wing or left wing, or it would be your left wing and my, yeah, but okay. Anyone on this side? I hear someone. No? You put your hand up, and if you know, why did Paul change Christianity, or introduce these ideas? Right? No one on this side. Oh, sister. So for the benefit of the
top hierarchy, like the people who consider themselves as religious class.
Oh, so the Christian Paul changed the beliefs, or he added new beliefs to satisfy the ruling class, the Roman ruling classes. Somewhat. Okay. Well, we'll give an answer to it. Very simply, this. Saint Paul wanted, the Roman Empire is kind of taking over the Mediterranean. Jews are a minority, and you have this religion that's very alien to the Romans, generally speaking. Abrahamic religions, that it's monotheistic, but monotheism can sell because the idea of one God behind everything somehow makes more sense than a chaotic cacophony of different gods, or arguing and bickering and having human qualities and limitations. But it was very austere, very rigid for the Romans. Right? The Romans were used to partying. They had their own philosophies, their own ideas. St. Paul made Christianity relevant for his time to the Romans, because, and we see this because he gets summoned to the church of Jerusalem, which was the first church, you could say the first Jama'ah, and he gets questioned, saying, Paul, we hear these disturbing rumors that you've been changing Christianity or changing the beliefs to sell Christianity to the Gentiles. Yeah, because Gentiles don't want to get. They don't want to get circumcised, and it's kind of hard to sell a religion where a male will be told they need to be circumcised, and not eat meat sacrificed to idols. How are you going to get your zabiha meat? It's very difficult in the Roman Empire, right? When most people are idol worshippers, and that kind of meat is available for selling. So St. Paul says, oh, this is all lies. Lies. I'm not introducing any new reforms or changes. No. But do we have to make the Gentiles, be circumcised? Do we have to make the Gentiles follow the exact laws of Moses? Because it's a bit too difficult. It's a bit rigid for them. And so he was told, okay, well, we'll have a reduced law system for the Gentiles. They are not allowed to eat meat that's dead, still living, I suppose, where it has blood in it. They're not allowed to eat meat that's sacrificed to idols, not to engage in sexual propriety, and so on and so forth. So they had a reduced law system for them. But then later on, St. Paul says in his epistles or letters that actually it's not really an issue to eat meat sacrificed to idols or to eat meat that still has blood in it, right? Which is obviously not halal, right? Because what matters is that faith is in the heart. Right? Does that sound familiar to you guys? Have you heard that before? Oh, that's weird. Why does that sound so familiar? Because he was trying to sell a product, which was Christianity, and you can't sell Christianity which resembles more Judaism to Romans. So you sell something that's a bit more relaxed, right? And of course, the Romans Stoic philosophy was quite popular. Stoic philosophy was the idea that you could self-discipline yourself. Also, it was a little bit Zen, so that you can go with the flow. You could say, with the universe, you flow with the universe. You just accept what happens to you. Very fatalist almost, rather than have expectations and be disappointed. So, Stoicism. Well, St. Paul says, well, you know what, why don't you be join Christianity? And I say, well, what's in it for us? And St. Paul will say, well, as a Stoic, you can't really discipline yourself 100%. Right? You'll never be successful. But you know what can work? The Holy Spirit will come in you and will change your nature and make you the disciplined individual you want to be. Yeah? So he's selling it. He's selling it based on the values of what the Romans agreed with or believed in. And of course the Trinity concept very much resembles Middle Neoplatonism, right? The idea of a monad and a logos and so on and so forth, which is like three different things. As part of this creating force is more than just a coincidence. So why am I using this example? Well, if St. Paul changed Christianity to be relevant, and he was successful, right? He was actually, because of now, the Romans adopted Christianity to become, Catholics and so on and so forth. It was successful. But he had compromised so much of the teachings of Jesus, it needed a new prophet to come to mankind to correct all the corruptions that he introduced. Yeah. So it was successful. If you want to water down Islam, to sell Islam to the West, many Westerners will love that. Will love a Western liberal or socialist or Marxist or conservative Islam. Yeah, they'll love that. Whichever particular school of thought that they are following, they'll love that if you present it to them. You say, "Oh, we just believe what you believe." Yeah, and they might adopt it, or as one non-Muslim I heard say, what's the point of the Quran if all it does is just justify whatever everyone is doing in any particular time period? Yeah, because that non-Muslim guy, he understood that it didn't make sense. Like, why would the Quran just say the status quo, rubber stamp, or whatever particular ideology you follow, rubber stamp? Well, then God doesn't have anything to say then, because it's just whatever humans are doing anyway, right? So the desire to change one's religion or belief system to match a society governed by a more powerful civilization at that particular point in time is nothing new. It's been happening for a long time. And in fact, many Jews had changed or introduced philosophical ideas, like the Essenes were influenced by Hellenic culture, by Greco and Roman culture, and they too were doing this even before the Christians came around. There were some Jews who were changing to adapt to this kind of dominant civilization. So again, nothing new under the sun. So let's start with the West. Where did the West get all this malarkey from, as we say, London? Christian political philosophy started out with the idea or concept introduced by Emperor Theodosius against non-Christians, that he famously said that freedom to sin be denied the wicked, i.e. error has no rights. Right? Falsehood has no rights. You might say, well, that makes kind of sense. Well, it does, but if he believes, and Christians after him believe, that anyone who denies the Trinity doesn't have a right to deny the Trinity because denying the Trinity is falsehood, then you kind of see the problem with that. And of course, Christians had so many differences of opinion concerning their aqidah, their beliefs, their core beliefs, later on, that this would become a major problem. And it did. But surprisingly, it wasn't necessarily between the Catholics and the Protestants who were kind of changing or introducing different interpretations of Christianity. It was actually between Protestants themselves. Protestants started to kill each other, fight each other, because they said the other Christian there, he's on the wrong aqidah. Okay? He's on the wrong aqidah, you know, he's an Ash'ari, I'm an Athari. Oh, sorry, I meant I'm a Lutheran and he's a Calvinist. And, you know, you have to kill them because, you know, or torture them, because by torturing them to the right aqidah, you're saving their soul. Okay? Or killing them stops them from spreading their falsehood, right, to other Christians and damning them to perdition. So Christians really didn't have a way of resolving how to manage aqidah issues, but also because of the changes that Christianity underwent, it was no longer a political religion system. Judaism has guidance for laws and politics and states and so on and so forth. Christianity generally just says obey the ruler, you know, don't speak out against the ruler, which was St. Paul's idea. Of course, that also sounds very familiar today. The first reformists, you could say John Locke and others, Thomas Helwys, but there were many others before them, who simply made the point. Now, I've only put the quotations up there just to show you where I got it from, right? So I'm not misrepresenting them, of course. But they simply just argued that it's not for kings to make people righteous, because if a king makes someone righteous by, you know, torturing them, then they're being insincere, so they're not going to be saved anyway. So there's no point forcing people on the right aqidah, because they're just going to be like munafiqs, like, you know, hypocrites. So the argument that God alone should punish error and not for humans to punish error was one of the major changes that happened in the West, because they didn't know how to resolve aqidah, ikhtilaf in aqidah, difference of opinion in aqidah. They did it by killing and slaughtering each other. So what was the Enlightenment? Well, Christianity proved to be so fractious after you had the 30 Years' War, which was in essence Europe's, you could say, equivalent in devastation, relatively speaking, to World War I or II. It devastated Europe. It was a fight between Catholics, between Protestants of various denominations against each other. Sometimes, weirdly, a Protestant faction would ally with the Catholics against a rival Protestant faction. It was really chaotic. But it was all these wars that these kings, who were kind of encouraged to engage in, to fight for a particular creed, but usually where it coincided with their interests too, or against a rival neighbor, kind of led European philosophers to try to seek alternative ways to resolve their issues. Now, yes, they were aware of ancient Greek thinking, and ancient Greeks, or what are classical Greeks rather, they thought about political systems and what would be hikmah of how to organize human beings. So the Enlightenment is really the birth of moral and political philosophy devoid of revelation. That's what it is, if you want to encapsulate it. Putting revelation aside and trying to resolve the difficulties of morality and political philosophy without revelation, because it was said, because Christians can't all agree on their interpretation of the Bible. So we as human beings, of course, will have to go somewhere else where we can all agree. And we can all agree using our intellects to come to common principles. Because as you know, people don't agree on religion, but everyone agrees on politics, right? Yeah, of course. So that was the thinking. that was the thinking. You can't trust the Bible because there's too much ikhtilaf on the Bible. There's too much difference of opinion on the Bible. I do apologize for the non-Arabic speakers. I do sometimes segue into it, so I will translate it. Ikhtilaf means difference of opinion, or just says difference. And the idea of man is the measure of all things, whereby you let human beings be the major concern rather than letting something beyond humans be a concern, would what they thought to be the most stablest way to organize society. Now, the Greek sophist Protagoras didn't mean what his words were twisted to mean. He was more like a relativist, basically that what is good and bad is purely your taste, purely what you want to do. He was more a relativist, but it was his words were taken and kind of applied through a different lens. Also, the biblical account of Isa alayhi salam, or Jesus, with give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, unto God what is God's, was twisted to give it a secular spin. Beforehand, it wasn't a secular kind of phrase, because give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and give unto God what is God's. What does God own? Everything, right? Yeah, it was a very clever turn of phrase by, allegedly by Jesus in the Bible. But then you see Thomas Hobbes comes later and starts to reinterpret it to say, oh, he was kind of talking about secularism, that there's a separation between God and the state. It's like, no, that's not what Jesus would have been saying if he did say that. Okay, so they determined a new basis for good and bad, and they didn't want to refer to divine law. Many of these were Christians, by the way. John Locke was devout Christian, wasn't an atheist. Right? In fact, he was rather intolerant of atheists. But he wanted to make a way that using the intellect to derive the natural law for human beings from observing nature. Yes, natural law. Hugo Grotius actually was the one who is accredited with being the most seminal thinker, the first of the most seminal thinkers on natural law, because he was trying to deal with international law, right? And internationally, people don't agree on the same religious books and morals and ideas, so he was trying to come with a universal set of laws that everyone can agree on. And he famously said, or infamously said, that to kind of, to deduce laws that, either whether Christians or the barbarous races would kind of see a commonality in, a law that would somehow equally subsist, even if we granted that God did not exist or did not care for humanity. So to find a natural law that would be objectively existent, even if God didn't exist, or a deist system, God didn't care about his creation. That was the beginning of, you could say, materialism. Okay, the origins of two political schools of the Enlightenment. You could argue, arguably, every madhab, every school of thought in the West today comes from the ideas of these two thinkers. And there's a divergence between them. Now, I kind of put empiricists on there, rationalists on the other side, senses first versus mind first. You could almost say that it started out with Aristotle. Aristotle was like senses first, and knowledge comes from your senses first, whereas Plato, it was from the mind first and then the senses. But this would have effects on the schools of thought that would emerge. And I'm not going to go into it because that's a longer lecture. We don't need to discuss it. But it would lead to the different schools of thought. From René Descartes, not that he anticipated this or intended it, you would get socialism, Marxism, general Hegelianism or social idealism. All this stuff would come from his stream of thinking. And you'd get liberalism and conservatism from Thomas Hobbes and his stream of thinking, or the English imperial Anglo-Saxon philosophy, basically. Senses first. This would lead to something that kind of looks a bit like this. A bit of colours for you there. Enlightenment really declares that man is the absolute sovereign. Every school of thought believes this concept. It is the common aqidah, the common creed of all these schools of thought, and they both believe in individualism and equality. Individualism is simply that man is the absolute sovereign. There's nothing higher than a human being. I use man in the sense of humans. You know, for the English language, it was originally just meant humans. So why man? Why not women? Don't. It means all humans. Enlightenment, the Enlightenment concept, the Enlightenment era held these two concepts to be sacrosanct. Everyone is absolute sovereign of themselves, i.e., there's nothing higher than you, there's nothing more absolute than you, there's nothing that owns you, you own yourself. And that we all possess equal ownership of ourselves, and hence we are equal in moral worth and political worth to each other. Think of it as a pantheon of gods. Each god is the absolute god of themselves, and they're all like equally in the same, of equal power or equal in the pantheon. That would be, in a way, how you can understand this. But they would disagree on which of these two concepts has more emphasis. Is it more individualism or more equality? Right? Which one? How do you balance this? Some would say that you only get true individualism via more equality. Others say you only get true equality via more individualism. They would have difference of opinion about this. But they all come from the same two concepts. Every school of thought does. Now, tomorrow, after tomorrow and so on, we're going to discuss what's on the, I should have put it on the left-hand side, but okay, what's on the right of that graph. Socialism, social democracy, Marxism, neo-Marxism. But we will discuss here today liberalism and conservatism, and how these emerge from these concepts. Social liberalism as well. Libertarianism is just really kind of like it's kind of more akin to classical liberalism, although it was never really it's never really been fully implemented. But they are absolute individualists. Although technically speaking, you could say the most absolute of all individualists are anarchists. But then again, you also have communists who are, in a way, communism aims at a type of anarchy, and so is really confusing. But yes, that's what we're going to discuss today, these two schools of thought. Just as an interesting idea, the concept that males and females were equal actually comes from the Cartesian stream of thinking, because the English empiricists thought that, well, women don't seem to be so intelligent compared to men, so therefore, by our empirical observations, i.e. speculations, that males are more intelligent than females. But that's because they didn't educate women, didn't have education systems for women, or rather, women weren't given kind of patronage to be educated, and only maybe the upper classes. So they made false assumptions, but the Cartesians made the argument that all human minds transcend the body. The mind-body duality, the mind and the body are like separate. So every human being has a mind that transcends the body, and if your mind transcends the body, then it doesn't matter what the body is. Right? But that means that everyone's equal, because you all have an equal mind. Okay, that would be their argument. Of course we'd say, well, what do you mean by equal mind exactly? You mean more intelligent? Because humans differ in intelligence, just across the spectrum of it, regardless of gender or whatever. Just within the same gender and within the same ethnicity, within the same set of tastes and preferences, you have people of different intelligences. So where are you getting this idea from? And of course, you could say that we have hormones that certainly do affect our thinking. The brothers here will know what I'm talking about. So, is there really a mind-body duality? Well, we're not going to discuss that today, but this is, you could say, the first feminist was François Poulin de la Barre, who came up with that. But we're not going to discuss that. That's going to be in about 2 days. 2 days from now, we'll discuss that more in depth. Okay. Anglo-Saxon liberalism, so we're going to really get into liberalism properly. Liberalism is simply the application of the idea that individual humans are owners of themselves, and it starts its political thinking from that basis. You don't need to talk about equality so much with liberalism, because if everyone's treated as an individual, then of course they're going to be equal. As in, of course the law will treat them equally, because everyone's equally an individual. But liberalism doesn't expect people to have the same outcomes, because the empiricists believe that humans were different. So, but as long as you don't treat them differently according to law, let their natural propensities arise as they may. The liberalism believes the good is respecting someone's sovereignty over themselves, and the bad is not respecting someone's sovereignty over themselves. Pretty simple. It's not only liberals that believe this, of course, but pretty much all the schools of thought believe this in some way, shape or form. But they have difference of opinion as to how the state can transgress against you to make you respect people's sovereignty. And what does it mean to respect people's sovereignty? Does it mean like you don't physically harm them, or you don't say a word they might not like? You know, what is respecting people's sovereignty? There's going to be difference of opinion about this. So the liberal would consider all political systems that do not base themselves on individualism as extremist and oppressive. It's their pejorative of choice. And of course, you might think that this might not have any implications for theology, but does anyone know why they call liberalism secular liberalism? Why not just call it liberalism? Why do you have to add the word secular at the very beginning of it? Does anyone know why? Why it's called secular liberalism, not just liberalism? No?
To highlight the fact that there's no God to be sovereign over the individual, to emphasize that?
To emphasize that there's no God of the individual? Not quite. Anyone else? Does anyone know? No? Stumped? Brother? Sorry? Freedom without any religion. Well, no, because liberalism wouldn't say that you have to remove religion from society, because religion can be enjoyed as a personal taste. Right? So they don't mind. They'll treat it as a personal taste, simply. Do you like kayaking or snowboarding? Your taste. So it's because there's something called religious liberalism, right, which is the twin of secular liberalism. Because if humans are absolutely sovereign over themselves in this life, then that must be because that's how it should be. But if that's how it should be, then how can God punish you for making sovereign choices over yourself if you own yourself? That would make God unjust to punish you for not praying to Him enough or what have you. So religious liberalism, they're the ones that would say that, those who go to hell, those are just murderers and rapists and so on, not those who didn't pray or those who didn't honor their parents or those who didn't give enough charity or whatever, right? Why? Because liberalism created an idea of good and bad. Yeah? Religious liberalism simply says that God also adopts this good and bad measure. So they believe that hell. They think believing that hell is eternal is bad because you do finite sin. So how are you given infinite punishment, quote unquote? I addressed this. I have an article on this online. I'm not going to address it right now. You can wait for the Q&A. But they adopted their theological implications. So if you meet a liberal Christian, a liberal Jew, a liberal Muslim in politics, you do not be surprised if their theological opinions about God are also liberal as well, because the two go hand in hand. Okay, John Locke, you could argue, created four key doctrines of the, or soul, of the Enlightenment of liberalism, to be more specifically. The supreme sovereignty of man, we've already discussed this. Man's property precedes any social contract of government, i.e. the government has to respect your property. So, because property came first before government, that's simply what he's saying. And of course, the socialists and others would disagree with that. They would. They obviously government came afterwards, but they have a different angle they approach that with. They believe that there's a necessity of limited government to protect and establish man's sovereignty. So they believe that government is necessary. An anarchist wouldn't, but liberals believe that it is necessary to protect your sovereignty against other human beings. And of course, the fourth principle, the transfer of man's sovereignty to government. Basically, you vote and the government then gets into power and can then tell you what to do because you voted for them. What it means is that you've transferred your sovereignty, a delegated sovereignty to them to rule on your behalf. Yeah, that's why they call themselves your representatives. And then they do whatever they want after the election. Okay, so here's a quotation from John Locke, just simply saying about just reaffirming his perception that humans are the absolute lord of their own, of themselves and their possessions, equal to the greatest and subject to nobody. All being kings as much as every man his equal. So that's just reaffirming what I already mentioned. The idea that property precedes social contract of government. So John Locke admits that nature is common to all human beings, but you own yourself. You don't own things in nature. From the trees, the farms, and so on and so forth. And you might think, oh, is he turning socialist? No, because he'll say that when you mix yourself with nature, i.e. you work, that becomes your property. Because you've mixed yourself into, so to speak, into nature. And so it's yours. And of course, your parents who mixed themselves into nature and got property, and of course, because it's their property, they can inherit it to whoever they want, and they want to inherit it to you. That's their choice. And so John Locke would be an advocate of the fact that you can possess lands, you can possess factories, you can possess whatever you wish. Socialists later would dispute that, and we'll discuss that in the next sessions. Government can't do whatever it wants to do, so it can't just decide to just kill you for fun, have the purge, or something like this. You know, the movie The Purge, you've kind of seen it, or what have you. So the government can't just suddenly go crazy and do that, so it has to be limited to some extent, and that's basically, that I'm not going to go too much into that principle. And the fourth pillar is that when you elect the government, you are giving it permission to rule you and to charge you taxes, to take your property, but for a common good. So that's why the government always wants you to vote, even if you don't vote for the particular incumbents in government, because voting is bay'ah, is a pledge of allegiance. If no one voted, the government, I mean, I suppose it's obvious to say this, but the government would have no authority over you. So, food for thought. John Locke's definition of freedom. Freedom is not to do whatever you want to do. No. Freedom is simply to live in a government or state where the laws are known, and within the permissible, what is permissible, within the mubah, you can do whatever you want to do. And like, so as long as you obey the law, the police can't arrest you. You know, the leader can't just come out and say, I hate that person, he's got a funny hat, let's arrest him and put him in jail. They can't do that. The leader can't say, I want those bunch of people's money, those rich people, because I'm in debt, so let's put them into a hotel, torture them until they give me their money, or cut them up with a saw because they spoke against me. No, that would be a tyrannical government that would have absolute power, and then he'd argue, you're the slave of that kind of leader, because only a slave who's owned can be done wherever, can be disposed of any which way by the owner of them. So John Locke was arguing that freedom only means that if you follow the laws, no one can touch you. That's what it means. Freedom within the law, basically. So a goldfish has freedom to go circle around the goldfish bowl, as long as it doesn't try to escape it. Okay. However, John Locke has a dark side. And the dark side is liberalism is intolerant. Right? It is intolerant. It is intolerant of anything that doesn't accept its paradigm or could transcend itself. So John Locke talks about, in essence he's referring to the Catholics. He said that the problem with the Catholic citizens is that they have obedience to a pope. The pope could decide tomorrow for the Catholics to go against their government in any particular land, and so the Catholics can't be trusted. So therefore, they don't really deserve to be tolerated. They don't, because they're not. You can't trust them in essence. He also said the same about the Muslims as well, that we are obeying the Grand Mufti, who is under the control of the Caliph, and therefore Muslims do not deserve to be tolerated. because you can't really trust them. They transcend the laws of the government or the state. And atheists as well. On the right at the bottom there, he says atheists. You can't trust them because they'll swear to you to fulfill a promise, but swear to what? Right? So yeah, he was a rather intolerant individual. But he wasn't the only one. Even the Continentals, Jacques Rousseau was also rather intolerant. This is just a quotation. You don't have to read every single thing. I'll summarize it for you, but the slides will be available for everyone after these lectures. So this is just so you know where I got it from. I'm not just making things up or pulling it out of a hat or something. So he argued that the best type of religion would be a kind of civil religion, a religion where the citizens believe that every other person is not going to hell and is not, even if they have a different belief or a different set of ideas. But if you believe in a religion that believes that other people's lifestyle choices or their particular doctrines mean that in the hereafter they'll be punished, well, that's not very friendly, is it? So we're not going to be friendly to you, basically what Jacques Rousseau said, and that these people should be not tolerated. Sounds rather familiar, doesn't it? Some would say in the same countries that he was saying this. It's still today they adopt this. So liberalism isn't tolerant. It never has been, never pretended to be. It's just intolerant to things which are not liberal, because it believes that it is justice, right? The materialist political theorist or political philosopher, whatever you want to call it, they believe that their ideas, their formulas are justice. So if you don't believe that, well, you're advocating injustice. And that's bad. And so you don't deserve to be tolerated, to be treated nicely, to be kind of given due process or given rights or what have you. So they can mistreat you any which way they want because you're a garbage human for disbelieving justice, for being against it, for being the boogeyman, as they say, for being the villain. But rather you just say, well, look, I'm not supporting injustice here. I just disagree that what you're saying, I don't think it is justice. And I say, well, you don't even say this because you support injustice. Because clearly my system, my way of life is justice. Right? You know, even as Muslims, believing Islam is the truth, is justice. Not even we don't have this perception because how so? Because we know that humans are fallible creatures. They are ignorant, and they might not know what Islam says. They might not know its truth, and so they don't know any better. And our job is to give da'wah, is to invite them and make them understand what Islam says. Ibn Taymiyyah talks about this, that there are non-Muslims who might not go to hell because they didn't know what the truth was. And they were sincere people, but they just didn't understand it. They didn't know it. Maybe it was even conveyed to them, but they didn't understand how it was conveyed. Maybe it wasn't conveyed in the best way. Right? But to a materialist, there's only this life. There's no hereafter to redress wrongs. Right? So if that's the case, then they won't let any perception of misjustice escape. Any of their perception of misjustice. So everyone must be punished here, right? And that's why materialism has led to some great, some rather massacres and very rather nasty things as people try to square the circle in this life with their formulas. And not just liberals, every ideology you want to pick, for the most part, or that has been implemented basically. Social liberalism. Liberalism becomes a full religion. Social liberalism. Liberalism realized it had problems. It gave rights and it gave freedoms, but you see, you had factory workers who were being exploited by their bosses. You had people that had no choice but to work in these bad conditions. You had people who didn't have voting rights and didn't have a number of things, didn't have obviously any kind of welfare, didn't have guarantee of food. So implementing pure liberalism is really is irresponsible to the weak. Right? You had the Bilderbergers and all these great corporations basically just amassing amounts of wealth. If you think concentration of wealth is bad now, you should go to the 1800s. Yeah, concentration of wealth to the 1% was 80%. They had to institute antitrust laws. And do you know who instituted that? Social liberals. Because old liberalism couldn't implement antitrust laws. Antitrust laws are restrictions on people's property. Why would a liberal do that? Yeah, as long as you're not stealing from people, then you should be allowed to do what you want with your property. No one can come and take it. If you had a contract with somebody and you didn't honor that contract, let's say you have to work for an employer, let's say 40 hours a week, and you were feeling unwell or you wanted to change jobs, but you had contracted to work for 6 months under the old liberalism, they'd say, well, you consented to sign that contract, so you will work those 6 months. If not, you will go to prison, where you would do hard labor. Right? Social liberalism came along and said, oh, maybe we shouldn't do that. Right? So modern day liberalism is actually social liberalism. Old liberalism, liberalism 1.0 failed 100 years ago, was replaced. So today's liberalism is social liberalism, which we saw you could say it was a reaction to the rise of socialists too, as well, but liberals were persuaded that you can treat everyone under the law equally, but what about equal opportunity? Okay? Because they believe the individual, everyone's an individual, that's great, but maybe give everybody the opportunity to excel. Maybe the state should do that. Yeah? If they want to be lazy, that's fine, then let them be lazy and be poor, right? But if they want to be industrious, what can we do to at least try to give some opportunity for a person to be industrious, and so on? And they believe that if everyone was industrious, it would lead to the hidden hand of the economy. It would mean everyone would be lifted up by people's industry. So still believing in old liberal principles, but adapting it to the weaknesses of the previous liberalism. In the UK, Thomas Hill Green he's the one you can thank or blame for the idea that the government should consider individuals' self-fulfillment or the full realization of the individual. So he was following Hegel. I'm not going to go too much in detail because I go on segues, so I won't do that. But the idea that the individual needs to flourish and needs to realize themselves. This is, in the UK, Thomas Hill Green is one of the major, not the only one, but one of the major influences. This is why cocaine is prohibited in the West, right? Because you think, if you want to consent to take cocaine, why does liberalism stop you? It's your choice, right? Your body, your choice. Yeah? Why does liberalism, I was going to say cannabis, but maybe not in Canada. So in England it's still prohibited. Why? Because the argument was that when you take crack cocaine, you make yourself dependent on the cocaine. The cocaine actually affects you. It's not simply just a recreational drug. It makes you dependent on it, and then you get reduced to poverty. You become a slave to it. And so in order to protect you from being a slave, your individualism being a slave to something else, that something else will be banned. Right? And they were going to do the same to alcohol, but it wasn't going to work because Americans need to drink, and in England the temperance they tried. They never experimented because obviously in America they actually did experiment, and they had the era of prohibition. But the temperance movement in England tried it, but they never even got implemented at all whatsoever. Because if the one thing that English people do is they drink a lot after work. So binge drinking is an English tradition. But they were going to, right? They were going to. So that's why you see this inconsistency that cocaine is banned, but alcohol isn't. Mainly because they couldn't get people to abide by the ban. But in principle, they would agree that you have to ban it because they don't want humans to be enslaved to something external to themselves. That was social liberalism. The social liberalism is what I suppose you have to thank for what you might call the success of like the civil rights movement in America. In the South, they made an argument which is separate but equal. Okay, whites and blacks will be treated separate. Would be under the same equal laws. They would just be kept apart from each other. Okay? So surely if you're a shop owner and the shop belongs to you, the Southerners would argue that then you get to decide who goes in your shop. That was a version 1.0 liberalism argument. Social liberalism comes in and says that denies equal opportunity to everybody, and so we have to ban that. We have to implement positive discrimination. We call that in the UK we call it positive discrimination, but whereby you need to force these individuals to comply to create equal opportunity, basically. But here's something else, right? They inadvertently created a new type of intolerance. Not with civil rights, but with free speech, or you might call free speech. Yeah, the kind of John Stuart Mill, who's a utilitarian, he made an argument. He said that society imposes a limitation on people's speech and ideas, expression of speech, worse than governments can. Okay? Because a government can only ban you, a policeman can only punish you if they hear you saying, some speech that is wrong. But society is everywhere, right? And if you go against the culture of society, well, you'll have to be, you can only be free in the privacy of your own home, maybe in the bathroom, if no one can hear you, right? So it was worse. Society gives an oppression that's worse. So in the name of kind of liberating the individual from the oppression, it was deemed that society has to bend to the individual and not impose restrictions on the individual. And you might think, but Abdullah, how is this inventing a new type of intolerance? Well, you see, if you express that you disagree with someone's lifestyle choices, let's just say you think that them putting pineapples on their pizza is a heresy, and that these individuals are reprobates that don't deserve to even breathe the air of this earth, well, you're imposing a social stigma on such individuals. Misguided they may be, but who are you to make a society intolerant for themselves? So, in the name of tolerance, you have to shut up. Right? You have to be quiet, otherwise you get the consequences. But the issue is that you've replaced in the name of tolerance, you will create a new type of intolerance. Because who decides which speech is more deserving than, or which opinion is more important than all the others? Well, liberals have a basis, which is, okay, is the action halal or haram? Is the action good or bad according to liberalism? If it says it's good, then people can't make any opinions public that might dissuade the person through peer pressure from doing that. Okay? So this is where they started to invent, obviously, come up with like anti-hate speech laws and things like this. Well, at least in Europe and such places, and in Canada, in the United States of America, they still follow an older version of liberalism when it comes to free speech, quote unquote, whereby nothing can impinge your speech. Although in practice there are actually quite a few things you can't say in the United States of America, and not just shouting fire in a cinema, but other things you can that you'll face consequences for. But I'm not going to go into that today. So John Stuart Mill elaborated that individuals need to be protected from society. That was a key milestone in social liberalism. And he argued that society must, by instruction, by legislation, to diminish the inequality of opportunity. So this is social liberalism. Now, if you want to say, well, what's the difference between social liberalism and, let's say, socialism, right? So socialism would say equal opportunity for everybody. Socialism would say equal outcomes for everybody. Yeah. Because the socialists, well, I don't want to give away tomorrow's lecture anyway, but the socialists would, they have an argument, but I'll wait till tomorrow. Okay. Lloyd George, who was a great British politician, he famously said, it is true that men cannot live by bread alone. It's equally true that a man cannot live without bread. So this was where welfare system was implemented, because there's no point, you can't be free when you're dead, right? Because you've suffered from malnourishment, right? So this is social liberalism getting to work. Previous liberalism would say, let them die, as long as they're free, right? As long as you can freely choose to die. Well, not only choose to die, but as long as you can do it freely. Whereas social liberalism would say that you have to create the prerequisites for freedom. Okay, so that in a nutshell is the two main versions of liberalism that has been. Social liberalism came about towards the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. That's when you see social liberalism rise both in the United States under the New Deal after the economic crash and depression, and in the UK a bit earlier with Lloyd George. So this is social liberalism, and that's the liberalism that you live under today, or liberalism 2.0. But before we go into the contradiction of liberalism, sorry, I put this slide in the wrong place. Conservatism, for conservatism is very misunderstood, because all you see are these, ranting evangelicals, and you think, oh, that must be what conservatives are. But a conservative, and there are many books by conservatives, they actually view themselves to be the scientific school. I know it's just funny because they're climate change deniers, but many of them. But they view themselves to be the school of the empirical school, right? The school of pragmatism, of what works. Yeah, and so I'll explain. The conservative arose, you could say its most famous thinker was Edmund Burke, but David Hume made such arguments similar to. David Hume criticized liberals, John Locke, and talked about natural law as nonsense on stilts, doesn't exist. Just because something is a way doesn't mean it ought to be that way. That kind of argument, that's him, does not imply ought. Anyway, I'm not going to go too much into that. Simply put, Edmund Burke saw the French Revolution, which went off the rails applying equality, right? So much so that he thought that everyone should be of equal height, so they should cut their necks off with the guillotine. Okay, I'm joking about that last bit. So I was like, oh, he said, the French didn't believe that. I know. Anyway, so he saw how crazy it went, and he said that you can't have rapid change overnight. You can't just have a radical implementation of these philosophies that you're adopting, because we're still ignorant about many philosophies. We don't know how human nature works, but do you know what we do know? We know what works when it has been experimented with, what has worked in the past. And what has worked in the past? Culture, customs. That was worked in the past. So a conservative, interestingly, as Edmund Burke, would believe you can get a conservative who's a classical liberal. So how can you be a classical liberal and a conservative? Isn't that contradiction? No, because a conservative would simply say that the principles of liberalism, as was first envisioned, worked very well and are a good basis for society. Or the conservative might argue that don't speak to me about implementing principles. Speak to me about the conditions that produce these principles. Liberalism didn't just pop out of the mind of John Locke. It came out of a social circumstance, with social institutions, with family, with culture, all these things being the way they were. Liberalism emerged out of that. So then if that's the case, you need to preserve or conserve the environment that generated it. Right? You see, it sounds convincing, doesn't it, now? So, I'll be a conservative now. Thanks, Abdullah. No, don't. Right? So, and there's a reason for this, which is, of course, conservatism doesn't have any basis for morality other than what it deems to be stability. Right? It's as simple as. Interestingly enough, the conservative Enlightenment thinkers, many of the Enlightenment thinkers, the founding fathers of the United States of America, all rejected democracy. They thought democracy was crazy. Democracy meaning that the people actually make the laws. Because that's real democracy. That's actually what democracy is, right? No, we can't have that. It's crazy. You can't let the people decide what the laws are. Have everyone equal making the laws? No, that's too much equality there. So they argued for a mixed system. Otherwise, you can call it a republic or a type of republican system, whereby the government represents you. But they are your betters, and they will make decisions for you, on your behalf. Obviously, they never met Donald Trump. But, so we see, obviously, David Hume talking about that you can't trust reason, because reason, your intellect is a slave to your nafs, to your passions. So people just reason what they want to reason, and you can't generate a universal system from your intellect. It doesn't work. Everyone's is biased and so on and so forth. that if there's a clash between freedom and authority, go with authority. Why? Because your freedom means nothing if there's no state to guarantee it. So then what's more important then? The state. Right. Yeah. So that's basically I'm trying to give it in a nutshell because I don't want to dwell too much on it. But the conservative will talk about traditional roles. They'll talk about traditional gender roles, traditional family. Why? Not because they necessarily are Christian per se, but merely because it worked in the past. The conservative always talks about Western civilization because they'll say, yeah, Western civilization, it went around the world, it colonized and so on and so forth, but that's because it was strong. And it was only strong because it had these social institutions there. Right? So the conservative would say, I know that colonialism was bad. Some might not say that, but they'll generally say, okay, maybe you don't like it, but you see, we have a choice. Either we have a weak West which can be colonized by foreign power, or we have a strong West that we can, at least be guilty over what it does. I prefer the latter. Right? That's how the conservative would look at it. Very pragmatic in their perception. Better to be the oppressor than the oppressed. Although they would say that they wouldn't necessarily oppress. But anyway, you'll find Lord Cromer, who was a kind of colonial official in Egypt for the British, he was talking about the emancipation of women in Egypt. Yeah, like, we have to... he talked about that if you emancipate the women, that's how you'll get the Egyptians to imbibe Western civilization the most. You target the women first. Yeah, because you tell the women, hey, I'll teach you these ideas and we'll give you more power and won't you enjoy this? Great. Okay, and then eventually the women will influence the men in that society. Yet, Lord Cromer was against women voting in the UK. What's that about? Was he a hypocrite? Well, maybe he probably was. But he was a conservative. Why? Because from his perspective, Egyptian culture was inferior. Right? It produced a backward civilization, evidenced by the fact that the British were conquering it. Yeah? So it doesn't deserve to be preserved. Egyptian culture or traditional culture doesn't deserve to be preserved. So it can be changed. So he's liberal when it comes to the Egyptians, but he's conservative when it comes to the British. That's how you get this dichotomy. The conservative would say, no, my principles are quite consistent actually. You see? So that's how conservatives generally think. Why conservatives would be anti-vaccine, why they're anti-climate change. Very, very simple. It's because they view these things as means for the government to encroach upon the freedoms and rights of the individual. Okay? If the government can give you mandatory vaccinations, that means that you're giving the government has the power. You live in a state where the government, if it wants to, can stab you in the arm with a needle against your will. Right? For an individualist, that's a nightmare scenario. Climate change. That's used as an excuse, they'll say, for the government to basically give us more taxes that is unjustifiable, take our property or limit our industries. Yeah, again, they view that as injustice. That's why they fight those things. Right? And of course, the schools of thought in the West are very, very weird and funny. The Democrats, right? The Democrats meant to be the party of the people, yes, in America, in United States of America. But during the Civil War, of course, well, which was prior to anyway, the Republicans were for full abolition of slavery, and the Democrats were against it. The Democrats were against the abolition of slavery. Why is that? Oh, simply because the average working man, white man, owns farms, and if you have a farm, you're independent. You make your own food, you make your own clothing, if you have sheep and things like that, you make your own stuff. You are independent. You don't have to go to a shop or sell your services. You grow your stuff from the ground. Very independent. Of course, you might need some help. Without their consent. And so the Democrat was like, well, we're going to support the farmers against the government. Whereas the Republicans, they were like, well, if we believe in the principles of freedom for every individual, and of course black people are individual humans like us, then surely we'll just be consistent with the principles we apply to everybody, right? In the southern states. So that's why you'd see these quirks of history. they have an internal logic to the schools of thought in the West. When I say internal logic, it doesn't make sense. It's completely irrational. But within the principles, these weird principles they've adopted, it has its own weird logic among itself. They apply it as they see it fulfills the logic. Edmund Burke argued that the nature of civil society is greater than the individual. It's quite interesting that individualists, like conservatives, talk about those things which are greater than the individual, which hence must be preserved against individual freedom. So you get these kinds of things whereby in the name of preserving the individual, you need to preserve the social institutions that guarantee the individual's freedom. And therefore, then, the social institutions are more important, at least in priority-wise, than the individual. That's how the conservatives would argue. Okay. Edmund Burke argued it cautioned making changes in politics, so be very careful when you make any changes because you could upset a delicate ecosystem, in essence. That's why conservatives, well, I'll say they don't like making laws, but they tend to make a lot of laws, usually laws to keep people out and to keep industries in. Adam Smith is credited with being kind of like the founder of capitalism. Not exactly, but he was against mercantilism, which is the idea that the government's the only way to be rich is you need to keep as much gold in your country as possible to be rich, right? Whereas a more free trade system seemed counterintuitive. Adam Smith argued that no, actually, you could actually get more wealth and more prosperity with opening up trade. He actually argued for neocolonialism. He argued that colonialism costs too much money. You have to get your troops to occupy other people's countries, and you have to pay their upkeep. Yeah, that's a lot of money. Why don't you get the natives to rule themselves with your own system? So they're applying the system that you want them to, but the rulers look like the natives, and you get all the kickbacks from a system that you set up and contracts that you initiated during the occupation, and they'll have to continue honouring those obligations, usually debt obligations afterwards, and then you can just get money without having to put your troops there. Win-win. Right? So Adam Smith made such arguments. He also argued that slavery wasn't cost effective because labourers don't work as hard as if they are incentivized by profit. Right? So that was you can thank or blame Adam Smith for all these ideas. Yeah, he was kind of, you could say, one of the first to use the word liberal, I suppose, in a more modern sense. It's liberal meaning an open system, or in its kind of more original in Latin, it means generosity. So the government is being generous by allowing these corporations and individuals to do trade and so on and so forth. Okay. Conservative thinkers, modern thinkers, you might not know this individual, Michael Oakeshott, he wrote many tracts and books against the left-wing thinkers and others who argued that rationality can get you justice, and he basically refuted those things, or he made arguments against them. Quite a sophisticated thinker. Most people don't know about him, generally speaking, but if you want to do some reading, there you go. Roger Scruton, more of a recent individual, but also a giant of conservative thought, if you'd like to. And of course, there are different sub-schools of conservatism, which I'll let you look into. Neoliberalism, everyone mentioned neoliberalism, which is basically applying an older form of liberalism. Again, in bringing it back from Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics is, you could say, social liberalism's economic system, which is the government should spend its way out of a recession, which is kind of counterintuitive, because to get out of a recession, shouldn't you just conserve the money and reduce your expenses? So, no, government should spend its way out of a recession, just like the pharaohs did. So, neoconservatives, they're the ones who believe that the government can temporarily reduce individuals' freedoms for a defense against a general enemy or threat. So they're all for waterboarding, torture, CIA black sites and things like that, and invading other countries around the world who are not democracies. Neoconservatives are all for that, because for them, yes, it might be going against certain principles that they believed in, but as long as it's temporary and done when necessary, then it's all fine. So those are neoconservatives. Anyway, So, to kind of wrap it up with just some general observations, liberalism is based on a false ontology. The idea that we are, we are individuals, yes, but it doesn't mean we're individualists, or individualism is not the basis to understand us. If anyone looked at you through a microscope, they'd see a whole bunch of individual cells. Does it mean now that you are not one person, because you're made up of a plurality of things, right? So it reminds me of that Monty Python sketch where it said, you're all individuals, and one says, I'm not, shut up, right? And everyone's like going against that one individual who ironically was being more individualistic by going against the crowd. Anyway, so individualism does not explain human society. There are things which are greater than us in many ways. One of them being the universe, laws of physics, and ultimately what created the universe. But also morality, language, these things that you didn't generate yourself, but you were born into and you have to abide by, because if you made up your own language, no one will know what you're saying, right? So there are things which are greater than yourselves. But that doesn't mean now that, again, collectivism is the way either, right? So, the individual is simply the smallest unit of mankind, much like your cells are. Doctors look at the healthy functioning of organs to keep the body as a whole functioning well, not any particular individual cell. Okay, right? So the doctor, if you're getting cut into pieces, for example, the doctors say, don't worry, you're getting cut into pieces, but all the individual cells are still there and fine. Well, yeah, but they're not connected anymore. You want them to remain connected. That's what you'd like, ideally. And of course, you know, if there's a cell in your body that decides it wants to do its own thing, you know, to explore its own individuality, to not follow the law of the genetic code that your body has an agreement upon, so to speak. Does anyone know what that cell is called? A cell that wants to follow, it initially was one of your cells, but now follows a slightly different variation, has become a heretic from your genetic code. Does anyone know what that cell is called? Or? Cancer, that's right. You have an immune system designed, every day you have cancer, by the way, not to scare you, but every day you have cancer, and every day your immune system knocks those cancer cells out because they were too individualistic. So there needs to be they apostated from the genetic code of your body and endangered the general body, right? So clearly nature doesn't seem to care about individualism very much. False ontology, liberal creed, personal consequences. So the belief that if you believe that we are individuals leads to contradictions with the concept of God, at least God that will hold us accountable for our actions. So you might say, no, God can punish you if you're a rapist or murderer. He just won't punish you if you don't pray, or he won't punish you if you don't, fast, and so on and so forth. But we don't believe that, because liberalism deems that to be your personal choice, and therefore it is halal, and so God wouldn't punish you for something halal according to liberalism, right? That's how they would argue. To which we'd say, no, but it goes beyond that more, because if you're an individual and you are absolute sovereign of yourself, did you vote for God? No. So then how can God account you from the liberal perspective if you didn't vote for him? All right? So then that's why some atheists are so angry with the concept of God, because who's God to tell me what to do? Who's God to punish me for whatever I do? Right? I didn't elect him, didn't choose him. Now you know why they think like that. And now you know why many people actually even become atheists, because they really started out as liberals, or adopting that general idea. Not only liberals believe this, by the way, there's many different, socialists might believe the similar things, but they differ with liberals on the issue of economic distribution of wealth, which we'll come to tomorrow. Anyway, so inevitably, religious liberalism leads to atheism, because ultimately God is incompatible with the presupposition that the intent and purpose by human existence in the universe is we are sovereign over our bodies. I also say it goes against the ontology of nature. Nature doesn't care about your sovereignty. If you're on a desert island with lions and tigers and bears, they don't care about your freedom to choose your lifestyle choices or your personal pronouns. They're going to eat you. They're going to eat you. You can call yourself Miss, Mr. They still will eat you. Just the same. They don't care about your right to life. So then, if there's no right to life in nature, do you even have a right to anything? Right? That's what David Hume would argue. It's just by social convention, and hence conservatives claim they have a stronger argument. But we would say that no, it's still relative. Right? It's always relative. Conservatives are relativists. We'll get to something in a second. Anyway, okay. I'd say that liberal morality is inconsistent with human nature. You can harm people. You can affect people more than just obviously physically harming them. You can cause frustration in people more than just insulting them. And liberalism needs to account for aspects of human nature that a materialistic ideology can't handle. People are born. Some people might be more intelligent than others. Some people are more prettier than others, handsome, stronger, fitter, more have better immune systems. People are different, and of course, if you think that we're all equal individuals, and yet you don't have something someone else has, you viewed it to be unfair. And if you view it to be unfair, what do we call that? It's called jealousy and envy. Right? It comes from the belief in equality. Envy and jealousy is simply the principle of equality, but only limited to this world. Right? As Muslims, we believe that, of course, if you have something that someone else doesn't have, more is expected of you. Right? And you'll be more accountable. Anyway, so let me just go all the way. I think I was going to... There's quite a lot of things to say about liberalism, but I kind of wanted to deal with the most major issues. However, I wanted to say just a quick note about capitalism, because it's obviously part of the where is it? Here we go. Yeah. So, okay. This is where the socialists are going to love me. They're going to be like, yes, finally we agree with Abdullah, finally. Yes, free markets do cause problems when you do not regulate what can be owned. And in capitalism, for example, public resources that have a public benefit, like water, like natural spring waters, oil and gas and so on and so forth, if they can be privatized by corporations and so on and so forth, then they can, in essence, charge you money for getting your basic necessities, right? Which was a problem of early liberalism, and of course now we have states that implement regulations because of social liberalism. But you can still own it, but there's all these regulations that you have to apply to you. But here's the problem. These energy companies, they know that they can make money without competing with each other, and they form little cartels, you could say, or they agree to let's all raise prices together and we all make profit, much more profit, and they do that, right? Little cartels, little guilds or what have you, that they kind of implement. Wealth is not distributed equally, of course, yes, but it leads to very skewed distribution of wealth. The point about wealth is, or at least money, is that it's meant to be a means of exchange. It means that you can use to exchange for goods. If it is not ensured that it flows everywhere, then people will be without. Now, I've made some basic points, but I'm going to some vague points. I'm going to start with the most basic core creed of liberalism, and why, no matter whatever it can do, it will never solve the problem of human economics. Does anyone know what's the purpose of economics?
Allocating resources.
Allocating resources. And what would you mean by that?
Filling needs and wants of people.
Filling needs and wants of people. Anyone else? What does economics mean? Why is this side so quiet? I'm going to start picking on people if you guys don't speak up. Come on. Well, what's the purpose of economics? Sister in the back.
We have limited resources on Earth, so basically each country decides how much resources they want to spend each year and how to divide that, basically.
Okay, so you have limited resources, so countries should decide how to divide those resources up. Okay, well, you all kind of missed the most obvious thing. Earth has resources. And they're in different places, of course, yeah? They're not usually all concentrated in one area. If you want to get your uranium for your nuclear power plants, you have to go to certain countries. You want to get your lapis lazuli for your genes, you have to go to Afghanistan. You want to go, you want to get grain, or places that have, lots of grain. It could be a great breadbasket. You go to Ukraine, well, not anymore. But you need to go to certain places that have a lot of, that do something very well. They have a lot of abundance of a particular resource, but they're not all located in one area. So what is the economic problem? Sorry? But what does trade do? Relocating resources. Okay, I'll take that. Distribution. Right? Distribution. Now, it doesn't need to be equal, it just needs to be sufficient for people's needs. Here's the thing. Anyone here study economics? Anyone here study economics? No? No economics students? What do you study at this university? I've been coming all these years, and like, what do people study at UBC? If I'm on UBC, why am I going to go to UBC for? What's its most popular subjects?
Women and gender studies.
Gender studies. Oh dear. I should have gone to SFU. No, I'm joking. Okay. So basically, there's a massive stonking lie that you get taught in your economic classes, your economics classes. It's called the human economic problem. Everyone heard this? Yeah, I think Sister didn't. She alluded to it, yes, I think she has heard of it. The human economic problem is, they say, humans have infinite wants, but there's only finite resources. So the only way to resolve this impasse, you'll never be able to resolve it, but just maximize production as much as possible. Heck, even the socialists would argue this. Maximize production, that's the way to solve this problem. Well, not solve it, but at least try to address it. And then, at least you'll have the best of the worst possible possibilities. You at least have the best of them, right? At least that's the best we can do. That's false. That's actually a lie. You think, like, well, are you sure? Because we pretty much have infinite wants. You should be sure that's not the case. Well, yes, we might have infinite wants. But how much needs do we have? How much food can you eat in one day? I don't care how American you are. There's a limit. There's a limit to how much food you can have. There's a limit to how much shoes you need, to how much jackets you need, to how many bags you need. Some sisters go like, what? I'm leaving now. This is a travesty. I need unlimited bags. No, joke. Okay, to be fair and equal, unlimited watches and cars, right? So, okay, so you don't have infinite needs. Your needs are rather finite. Right? So then the Islamic economic solution is guarantee everyone's limited needs, and then after that, have a free economic system for the wants, the luxury wants, the ones that are not necessary needs. That's the Islamic economic system. Now, this refutes the core creed of capitalism. There's so much more you can say about capitalism. I've done some lectures where I just talk about, I compare the Marxist economic system, Islamic economic system, and also the capitalist economic system. Capitalism is just the economic system of liberalism. And conservatives also believe in capitalism because it's the economic system of classical liberalism. So hence, that's why conservatives were viewed to be blue on the poster, and liberals were yellow, because that was initially liberalism, or the liberal parties were yellow. They had the yellow flags and so on and so forth. But just coincidentally, you mix them together, you get green, and that's called capitalism. I was going for the color of money, or at least American money. But basically. Capitalism is the economic system of conservatives and liberals, but its core foundational creed is false. And Islam has a very detailed system, which is very different from socialism and Marxism, and very different from capitalism. If you want me to crudely simplify, which in no way really gives you any real information, it's somewhere in between. But that's very crude way of discussing it. So I'm going to wrap up the lecture by saying that Islam has disagreements with a number of ideas which were adopted by liberalism, but are not necessarily part and parcel of liberalism. You can be liberal and not believe in democracy. You could be, Napoleon Bonaparte wasn't elected right? But he was a liberal dictator, so the French still love him, right? But Islam believes that the majority doesn't make right. Okay, Islam believes that good and bad must only be decided by the Creator. But what the Quran says, discharge your affairs by mutual consultation. Isn't that democracy? It says discharge your affairs, not decide your affairs by mutual consultation. Right? Don't make that mistake. Of course, I think the brother with an impeccable name mentioned in the Quran recitation this verse about those who make their desires ilah, a God, something that can make something good and bad by its own choice, right? That in essence is liberalism. If you own yourself, if you believe that you are the absolute sovereign of your own body, then you have made a God out of yourself, because you didn't make yourself, you didn't create yourself, and you're certainly not going to stop yourself from being destroyed. So, are you a God? I don't think so. So then who are you to say that you decide? You say, well, but I control myself. You say, okay, well, I could break in someone's car and control that car, and drive it around. Doesn't mean I own it now. I can't say, officer, well, I sold the keys and I can now control the car, so it's mine now. Right? No, just because you control something doesn't mean you own it. And of course, not equal are the things that are bad and the things that are good, even though the abundance of the bad may dazzle you. So good and bad is not determined by majorities of people. That's obviously a ridiculous concept. And guess what? The founding fathers of America and so on, they all agreed with this. This is not going against what they were saying. They didn't trust the people, the common people. They were worried that the common people would vote to take the wealth of the rich. Right? So they wanted to implement a system. The American system and most systems in the West are designed to prevent majoritarian popularism from completely wiping out all the rights and principles that the state was meant to was established, usually involving protecting the wealth of the rich, of course, and the wealth of others. But still, it was designed to prevent it. That's why you have separate houses. Initially, the Senate in America wasn't voted; it wasn't elected on. In America, we have the House of Lords, which are not elected, but they are meant to be aristocracy. The aristocracies, and they inherit it. So that was designed because you can't trust the common people, right? So, hey, don't condemn Islam for something that the founding fathers of modern Western civilization themselves also agreed. But what happened was because democracy, the term, it sounds really nice, sounds like other people are in control. So they kind of relabeled republicanism democracy, right? Even though demos kratos in Greek means that the people control the power. They actually, they have the power. They don't just elect someone to have power. No, they are the ones pulling the strings. Okay? The Greeks would say, this is not a democracy. This is a type of republican system, a mixed system perhaps. It's not a democracy at all whatsoever. They'd be against it. Anyway, very key point for those of you who might believe in these ideologies. Justice is not anything you want it to be. I think what the Brother Ahmed was alluding to is many Muslims, they say, the Quran commands justice. Okay, now let's leave the Quran here. Right, so justice according to Karl Marx is, the definition is by John Locke. So wait a second, don't change books. Don't change books. Yeah, justice, great. Stick to the book you're reading from. Yeah, bait and switch, right? Some left-wing and even maybe some right-wing Muslims will talk all about justice in the Quran. The Quran commands justice. They'll be all for that until it gets to the definition, and then they go out of the book. They go off book, and they find the definition outside. And if you think that you're impervious to this, no, because you already use terms that have definitions outside of the Quran and Sunnah. For example, use the term racism. Right? That's not an Quranic term or a Sunnah term. We have concepts like asabiyya and kibr. Yeah, those are the things that are prohibited. But when you use a Western term, you then become a slave to those who define that term, and it's not us. Yeah? Then they can declare all kinds of things racist, and they can declare things that would be kibr and asabiyya, not racist. We'll get to that in the next couple of days. How you can insult someone's ethnicity and it's not racist. How's that possible? Well, I'll show you how some left-wingers can just justify it, because we'll come to that. I was about to give the goat away. No, I'm not going to mention here. So, Islam gives you two bases for justice. One is giving to those what is deserved, determined by God. God determines obviously what you deserve, what you don't deserve. And a general principle which is treating like cases the same. Being consistent. So if a poor person commits a crime, you punish them the same way as a rich person commits that same crime. Right? So that's it really. Now I'm going to finish up with some interesting slides. Which is Muslims that adopt liberalism, they have to justify that to themselves, because the Quran and Sunnah, just reading it, doesn't seem to be very liberal or conservative. We'll get to that in a second, but it doesn't seem to be very liberal. How do they justify it? Well, they say that, well, all the narrations of the hadith that disagree, the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad some that we have, which have been preserved by transmitters, they're all fabricated, or those that they don't like are coincidentally fabricated, and those obviously that they like are not fabricated. They'll say that, well, actually, the Prophet Muhammad was like sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a liberal, but he just was misunderstood by every single person around him, such that every school of thought, no matter how early they branched off, all somehow misunderstood. There was no single school of thought broke off and understood him correctly. Yeah, but thankfully, and purely coincidentally, of course, the modern day 21st century West is following the exact same ideology that is the Prophet Muhammad was teaching. So hey, we can just, we can rediscover it. Yeah, by seeing what the 21st century West will say. Of course, and as 21st century liberalism might change over the years, we'll then discover that, no, actually the Prophet Muhammad was actually talking about other stuff, actually. He was talking about some other, he was now pro-transgender and whereas 40 years ago liberals wouldn't be that. They would be against transgender, for example, as a concept. Yeah? So, as things change, you'll find these people coincidentally discover that the Prophet Muhammad was saying this all along. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And of course, this can lead to apostasy, from leaving Islam. Why? Because eventually they have to be honest with themselves, and they say, but if the Quran was meant to be liberal, and the Prophet Muhammad was a liberal, why were they such bad communicators, using words that seem to suggest a very illiberal type of ideas and worldview? I mean, is Allah a poorer communicator than John Locke? John Locke makes liberal arguments pretty clear, right? Why can't the Quran do that? And eventually they'll then say, well, that's because if liberalism is justice and the Quran doesn't support liberalism, then it must not be from God. Whereas what they should have done is liberalism even just or justice? They don't challenge that. They've already accepted it. Of course, some people might say Islam is the product of its time. Or Islam was the product of its time, but it was intended that as things change, you would change along with it. Well, then good and bad is relative, right? And you could say that all the Vikings going around raping and pillaging, oh no, that was okay because they were just the products of their time. So, it was okay for them to do it, right? Because that was just what they were doing. That was what the custom was ridiculous. So Muslims who succumb to liberalism not only undermine Islam, but as they think liberalism is the true definition of Islam in justice, what do they do to Muslims who don't join them in being liberal? What do they think of them? They think that you are holding on to unjust Islam, and therefore not Islam. But then if you're not following Islam, then you're following disbelief. And then you must be then disbelievers. Right? And the guy on the right is Khalid Abu Fadl. He talked about a cosmic war against Puritan Muslims, i.e. most of you guys probably. As a cosmic war against them because they are following the wrong version of Islam, which advocates injustice due to old structures of society and so on and so forth. And the one on the south is Irshad Manji, who argues for that Islam supports, obviously, same-sex relationships and things like this, which, as I said, now, I know in Canada, there's people are like, oh, I can't mention this in Canada, I mentioned this. Look, as Muslims, we believe that same-sex relationship or same-sex intercourse, the actual act, is not morally equivalent to intercourse that occurs within marriage between mature adults of opposite genders. That's our opinion. And it's not just our opinion, it's our certitude. Okay? Now, if we can't say that, then that means that you're saying that our beliefs cannot be tolerated. Right? Now, just because we believe it doesn't mean that we think that we must be mean to people who practice that or who have that as a taste and a preference. No. Right? We can be polite. We can help them with their baggage to the supermarket. From the supermarket, we can be good neighbors. We can be good co-workers. But need we agree with their lifestyle choices to do so? No. Otherwise, then then we won't be tolerated. We're not tolerated then. Of course, eventually, such arguments aren't being made. That merely to voice your opinion on that is intolerant.